In this nugget, we'll be taking a look at computer accounts. With computer accounts, they're very easy to create from Active Directory users and computers, and there's not that many options you have to fill in, so we'll just quickly show you that. We'll also point out that just creating a computer account in Active Directory users and computers is not the same as joining that computer to the domain. That has to be done as a separate step. Or if you join the computer to the domain from that workstation or member server, it'll automatically create the computer account for you, and you don't have to manually create that as a separate step. We'll also take a look at redirect CMP, or to redirect the computer accounts so that they don't go in the default computers container, but elsewhere as you like. Now, we talked about that in a previous nugget briefly, but we'll show you also some pitfalls possibly with this as well. We'll take a look at batch automation so that you can create multiple computer accounts at once without having to do such manual drudgery of individual computer accounts. Then we'll look at moving computer accounts and who can move them and where they can go. Then we'll look at troubleshooting computer accounts, which relates also to resetting computer accounts. This is important because without the proper computer account trust relationship with the domain controller, users cannot log on to the domain. Now, we've been talking a lot about user accounts and logging on user accounts and making sure that all of that goes right, but there's also another kind of an account we need to make sure it can log on, and that's a computer account. You see, the system sees a computer account as a user as well, or at least Active Directory does, because it does have a username, and it is a security entity. It does have a SID, or a security identifier, and it does have a password. During startup, and before you get to the Control-Delete dialog box, the computer has already logged on to the domain by using an agreed-upon password between the client and the server. Now, joining computer accounts to the domain is only relative to NT4 and later operating systems. That's really pretty much what we'll be discussing here. Now, how do you join a computer to the domain? Well, first of all, for example, here I've got client 01, which is already a member of the domain. But if I wasn't, it would look something like this. It would have workgroup membership like this. If I would go to the system properties and were to click on the change button that you saw there in the background. Now, once I see that it says workgroup, if I say, you know what, I don't want it to be a member of a workgroup, I want it to be a member of a domain, I can enter in either just Nugget Lab as the flat NT4 style flat domain name and click OK, at which point it will then go ahead and find that domain, and it'll find a domain controller for that domain. But it's better if you do the fully qualified name of the domain, which would be nuggetlab.com. Well, why does that make a difference? Because, you see, if you enter in the DNS style name, which is the .com style that I've got here, then it will immediately look for a DNS server instead of using NetBIOS resolution. So if we cannot find nuggetlab.com by typing that in right here, we know already on this client we have a DNS problem, and that will just help us to advance troubleshoot another issue right away while we're here. And then we'd click OK, and then we would click OK here in this dialog box, again, the system properties, at which point we would be asked to restart the computer, and you'd have to do that for the system to complete joining the domain. At which point, once that's finished, then you'll see the computer account here like we see it in the computer's container. Now, when we join it from the client like that, whether it's XP 2000 or 2003, it'll automatically put the new computer accounts into the computer's container unless you use the redircmp command that I showed you earlier, redircmp, that I showed you in a different nugget. And that way it can automatically dump it into a different container. But in any case, that's how you could create a computer account in the domain by doing it from the client side. You could also do it from the server side by right-clicking in Active Directory users and computers in any container that you want, computers or one of these other OUs. Choose the new computer. And once we're in this, we just enter in the name of the computer that we want, client 99, let's say, and we can specify who can join the computer to the domain, so that if I'm at a workstation that's client 99 and I want somebody that's a member of my help desk support group to be able to join the group, the computer to the domain, I'll click change over here, and then I'll enter in the help desk or whatever it is that they're called, and then they will be able to join that computer to the domain. Now, keep in mind that even domain users can join computers to the domain as long as they're local administrators on their own machines. In fact, they can add up to 10 computers to the domain, and Active Directory will track that and keep track of how many accounts a given user has added. And that seems a little bit more like an administrative function. In fact, a friend of mine and I asked Microsoft about this some years back, because this has been true in Windows 2000 as well. And we weren't getting any answers. We kept asking, we didn't get any answers. And finally, one of the main developers up there that was responsible for the ability to join computer accounts to the domain called my friend back, and he says, hey, I understand you want to know something about why we allowed computer accounts to join the domain and just allowed domain users to do that. And he says, yeah, what's that about? And the developer said, Well, I kept asking everybody if they wanted users to join computer accounts to the domain, and I never got an answer back, so I just decided to make it 10. I could have made it more if you wanted to. Well, in any case, that's a little history on why users can join computer accounts. Now, again, you can change that if you want to allow different groups to join. Also, you can check this box if it's a pre-Windows 2000 computer. In other words, NT4 kind of a computer. And you can also, if it's an NT4 backup domain controller, check this box if it's a backup domain controller. In our case, it wouldn't be, so we would just click on Next. And that's pretty much it, except for this dialog box, which would specify that this is a managed computer, at which point you would enter in the computer's unique ID. You can see that unique ID, which is normally a universally unique ID or a globally unique identifier, which is just two different ways of saying the same thing for our purposes. And this can be identified by looking at a sticker on the case from the vendor where the machine came from. You can also often find that directly in the BIOS. And you may be able to find it also if you examine a DHCP Discover packet, which is a packet that a client will issue where it's trying to find an IP address. And if you analyze that packet, it will often also be advertised in that packet. In any case, wherever you find it, you enter it in here, and it's a big old long sequence of numbers here. You can also enter in, if you don't know the GUID, but you do know the MAC address, you can pad the beginning of this 32-character sequence with just a bunch of zeros, followed by the MAC address, whatever that is. And the MAC address is simply the unique identifier for the network card. If you don't know what that is, you can go to a command prompt, type ipconfig, if I can type right, followed by a /all, and it gives you the MAC address for every network card that you have installed on a machine. Then once you've done that, you can just go ahead and click Next and Finish. I haven't entered in enough characters here, so it's not going to take, and it's not a managed computer anyway. By the way, the reason why we use managed computers is mostly for purposes of remote installation services or RIS. We don't really discuss RIS in this particular topic. However, that is the ability for us to take a client computer, boot it up on the network. When it seeks a DHCP address, it also can find a remote installation server or a RIS server from which it gets its source files for installation of Windows 2000, which didn't used to be possible, but it is now. So it's Windows 2000, Windows XP, and Windows Server 2003. Then those computers can be installed over the network rather than having someone take a CD to each computer. In any case, they often need to have a GUID if you're going to give them that capability, so that's what this whole dialog box here would be for. We don't need it for that purpose, so we'll just Next and Finish, and that's pretty much it. Now then, for me to be able to create this computer account, I have to be a member of the built-in administrators group, of which domain admins are already a member, as well as enterprise admins. I could also be a member of the account operators group to create this computer account. And then lastly, again, I can also create this computer account kind of remotely, if you will, if I'm an administrator of a remote machine and I'm joining it to the domain remotely. When it tries to join it to the domain and it does not see a computer account for it anywhere on the domain, then it will go ahead and create one automatically in the computer's container, and it can do that for any authenticated user, provided that authenticated user is not using just a local account on that workstation or on that 2000 or 2003 server. They have to be using an account that is here. For example, they would have to enter in credentials for Phoenix user 08. So that even though they're just domain users, they are still an authenticated user and able to join this computer to the domain. Now, let's also take a look at the domain controllers. When you run DC Promo on a computer, on a Windows Server 2003 or a Windows 2000 domain controller, then it creates a computer account in domain controllers instead. Notice that this is a different kind of container. It's an organizational unit, not just a container like computers. Since computers doesn't have organizational unit properties, it can't have group policies attached to it, then it's kind of left exposed in the computer's container, and you might want to change that by using the redir CMP command to automatically create computer accounts in other containers. For domain controllers, since they're already automatically plopped in the domain controllers OU, they're already automatically subject to the default domain controllers group policy object. Now, I think I've mentioned in a previous nugget that a lot of times I'll create a new organizational unit here that is totally locked down in terms of policy, and I'll just call it, in fact, LOCKED, down, locked down, and I'll just put the mother of all policies on that. And then when I create new computer accounts and user accounts, I'll put them in here before I decide where they need to go, whether they need to go to Tucson, Phoenix, wherever else they need to go. That way, I don't have any accidentally created renegade accounts that have just been plopped into computers and users without any policies on them. Now, in order to make that effective, especially for those accounts that are being joined to the domain out in the field and not being joined with created computer accounts here at the local domain controller, I want to go to a command prompt, and I'll just type in redir cmp to redirect the computer accounts as they're created to the container of my choice. In this case, I might redirect them to that locked down container like this. And this is very similar to the redir user command that we saw in a previous nugget. So we would just redirect it to the distinguished name. We want all new computer accounts to be redirected to locked down organizational unit in nuggetlab.com. We press enter, and the redirection is successful. Now let me point out one other thing with this, both with redir user and computer. Once you use the redir commands to redirect as appropriately, if you'd make a change later on, for example, to your organizational unit structure, and you don't want this lockdown OU anymore, once you have redirected to it, you can't delete it. So I try to delete it right here by pressing delete on my keyboard. Do you want to delete it? Yes. I can't. Why? The delete operation could not be performed. Well, thank you for that very generic message. It doesn't really tell me anything other than the fact that I'm just an abject failure here. All right, so what is it that has caused this to be undeletable? Well, when you use redir user or redir computer, it adds a special attribute, and it turns that attribute to true on that container. And if we look at a utility called LDP, which is a lightweight directory access protocol browser, which is a little beyond our scope, but I'll show you the basic usefulness of it here so that we can see the attribute we're looking for. We can go to the connection item, click on connect, and if you have a remote server you want to connect to a different domain controller, you can just type the name of that server in and click OK. I'm already where I need to be, so I'll just click OK here, and it'll connect me locally to DC Nugget 1, which is what I'm on right now. And then I also need to bind, and I'll bind using specific credentials. So I'll bind myself to the to Active Directory so that I can look stuff up here. And I want to look stuff up in the view of the tree view. So I'll go to View, Tree, and look for the organization unit that I need to see, and that would be the OU of locked down. Now, you don't need to know every little detail about LDP. I'm just showing you this kind of as a supplemental tool to show you where this attribute gets turned on. Here we're looking at locked down in nuggetlab.com. Gives us some unique information about it, when it was created, what its update sequence number is in Active Directory so that it can keep track of whether or not been any changes made to it. There's its GUID. And then what we're really looking for here is this item right down here. This attribute is critical system object, and that has now been marked as true. That's why I can't delete that. Now, how do I fix that? Well, you could fiddle around in Active Directory and forcibly change that, but that's probably not wise. The reason why it's set to true is because Microsoft wisely did that so that when you redirect objects to that lockdown container, and if you were to later on delete that, then any new accounts would have no place to go, and that could put you in a real position of uncertainty. So the way to fix that would be simply to redir computer again, and this time instead of going to the OU of lockdown, go to some other container where you'll know you want it to go, or you can really even send it back to its normal container, which would be common name equals computers. Press enter. Now once I've done that, it will take me back to, or rather I will go back to LDP, look again at this distinguished name, and now we see that that is critical system object has been changed back to false. Now when I go to lockdown to try to delete it, it will allow me to delete it. And I just show you all of that because sometimes months or even years will go by between the time you use the redir command, then you come back in here in some kind of an organizational change and try to delete that, and you can't, and it's really confusing and baffling. Some other people have really run into some problems with that. And also be aware of the fact that if you use redir computer or user to an organizational unit, you cannot rename that OU, and you cannot move that OU to a different location. Now then, another thing you'll need to be able to do is to create multiple computer accounts at once. And we can do that using a batch file. You can use netcomputer add, and you just enter the name of the computer from a command line there. You can also use other command line utilities, such as dsadd. Now to use dsadd, I like to use the spreadsheet, similar to what I did for the users, remember from a couple of nuggets ago. And if you are skipping around and you haven't followed these nuggets in sequence, I recommend you go to the section that talks about automatically adding user accounts, because that will give you some more background on this whole spreadsheet. If you have been following this, you may have already downloaded this. I've just added another sheet here called computers, and it follows the same syntax using the concatenate statement to create a dsadd statement, this time for a computer as opposed to a user like we did before. And that's pretty much all I need, or all I really need is this one line right here, and the rest of these are options that I normally don't even use. I just left them in there so that you could see them if you wanted them. For example, the SAM ID, it would automatically name the SAM ID the same as this computer ID over here in the CN field right there. So I don't really even have to have this unless I want to name it something else for the SAM name. Very rarely would you really need to do something like that. And then for the description, I've just entered it as Tucson Workstation. Again, that's pretty much going to be mostly for administrators to be able to locate machines and to identify things, as well as for the location, just for our information. Now, one thing you could do is also to add the computers to a security group. I have a a security group called Tucson Computers here in Active Directory Users and Computers, and you see it right there. Now, also, it's not that common to add computer accounts to a security group, but there may be certain isolated instances in which you need to do it, so that a computer account needs to gain access to something. It's much easier to access it by a group than to individually add one computer after another in an ACL. So once again, even though I don't normally do this, I just went ahead and did it so you could see the syntax there. And then, similar to what I did for the users, I'm just going to select all of this stuff, and then I'm going to use the autofill function to go down a few lines here. And let's just go ahead and create through client 60. You see that it's automatically filled in all of these fields for me. And then if I go down here, I'm just going to copy these. And then I'm going to go to a spreadsheet, rather to a batch file, excuse me. It's called addcomputers.bat. I'm going to right click on it and choose edit. Once I get to this, I'll simply paste in the lines that I copied previously, and then you can, these should be just fine, but you can kind of go through these and double check them if you want. I have found from my experience that one of the most common mistakes to make, at least for me, is to forget to use the spaces. So if we go back to my spreadsheet here, look at this, for example, the concatenate statement with the SAM ID. I've got a space in front of the SAM ID option there. If you don't put that space in there, then it just squishes SAM ID immediately right next to this statement, and it just gets to be gobbledygook and the command won't work. So make sure that you put in spaces where necessary if you create one of these on your own. Now let's go ahead and go to the end and pause this so we can check to see if there's any mistakes. I'll exit this and save it. And then, again, you can see in Tucson, I don't have any computer accounts yet, but I'll double-click on the batch file that we just created using that spreadsheet. We double-click on it. We see that it goes to work creating some computer accounts. It'll pause at the end. We don't see any error messages, so I'll press any key to continue. Now we go back into the Tucson OU. I'll refresh the screen, and we see that we have all the computer accounts that we expected to see. Now, one of the other advantages for using this kind of a command is that if we don't use if we don't use reader computer to move it into a different OU, well, the command itself specifies exactly where we want those computer accounts to go, so it doesn't even matter if we've used reader computer or not. Also, even if we have used reader computer to put it in one of those kind of locked down OUs or something, if I know that these computer accounts go to a specific department in Tucson and I want them available right away rather than having to automatically have them created in this kind of catch-all container and then dragging them back to Tucson, then again, using the dsadd command, I automatically put them wherever I want them to go. Now, in addition to the dsadd command, I can also use another utility, command line utility, called netdom, N-E-T-D-O-M. Netdom is very useful for a lot of different things from a command line. Just one of those functions is be able to create computer accounts. Now, all I really have to have is netdom add : and then the name of the computer that I want to add. That would plop it into whatever the default container is for new computer accounts. In my case right now, the computer's container. What you can also do is redirect it to a specific container of your choosing, in this case the organizational unit, which you see here, of Tucson. Now also, if you need to enter in any credentials, you can enter in those. For example, if you were just logged on as a domain user and you needed to add 20 accounts here, then you would not be able to add them as an authenticated user because you would exceed your limit of 10 accounts. So in that case, you might need to enter in credentials, which you see that I've tacked on to the end here now, and that would be /user_d, and then : and then the name of the user, which is an administrative account, and then /password D, and then whatever the password is. I just threw in a bunch of F's there, but whatever that password is, then you would be able to add the computer account using these credentials. And if you want to, again, you can use a spreadsheet to create a batch file to create a whole bunch of these at once, but just all you need to know for the time being, really, is just the basic syntax for how you create it, and the fact that it is possible to create computer accounts using the netdom command. Now, for our purpose, I've just shortened this because I'm already logged on as trainer, so I don't need those credentials, and I'll just press enter. We'll see that the command completes successfully, and if I refresh the Tucson organizational unit, sure enough, there's my client 61. Now, again, you can use another command called dsmove. And again, I would suggest using a spreadsheet if you had a whole batch of computer accounts you wanted to move. But let me show you the basic syntax of what you'll need to do. For example, with client 51, if I wanted to move that to the Phoenix OU, then I would use dsmove common name equals client51 in its distinguished name, and then followed by the new parent, which would be in the Phoenix OU. And then alternatively, I could also add a new name here with a dash new name, and then whatever the new name I want it to be. For example, Phoenix Client 51 in this case. And then I would press enter, and we see that it has successfully done that. Again, we have to refresh the screen here in the Tucson OU to see Client 51 disappear. And then we click on Phoenix to see it reappear here, and after we refresh, now it's been renamed also to Phoenix Client 51. And you can use DSMove to move any kind of Active Directory object, including users, computers, and groups. Now let me also point out that as an administrator, particularly a domain admin or an enterprise admin, I can move accounts between OUs. I can move accounts between OUs and into or out of users or domain controllers, or I can also move user accounts and computer accounts and group accounts into the built-in container. But even as an enterprise or domain admin, I cannot take these default accounts that are already there and move them elsewhere. I'm clicking and dragging and nothing happens. I can't right-click and choose move. It just doesn't allow us to do those kind of functions. Now, if I'm an account operator, likewise, I still can't do the same function here. I can't drag things out of this built-in container. And likewise, I cannot move anything into or out of the domain controller's organizational unit. So let's also talk about some problems that can occur with computer accounts. Now, this doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it can really be kind of baffling. For example, I've got a user that's maybe been away on maternity leave. They've been gone, about 40 days, and then when they try to log on with their laptop, which they took home with them when they went on maternity leave, they enter in their credentials. Let's say it's Phoenix, user 01 here, and they enter in their password, and they press enter or click OK, and it gives them this message. Ooh, cannot connect to the domain. Well, that Ethernet cable's plugged in. The domain controller is down or otherwise unavailable. We got a bunch of domain controllers. I ought to be able to connect to something. Or the computer account was not found. Well, that doesn't sound right either, because it worked before I went on maternity leave. So that must not be the issue. Contact your system administrator. Well, I guess I'll pick up the phone and call that guy. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that can happen. It's kind of be a little bit baffling, because they'll read that message to an administrator, and they say the computer account's not found. Well, the administrator goes to Active Directory users and computers, and they say, hey, there's client 1. I know your computer account's there. Nobody's disabled it or anything, so what's the big deal here? Wonder why it's not working properly here. Well, see, the issue is that computer accounts, when they are joined to the domain, they will generate a password that's agreed upon and synchronized with the domain controller. And then the next time they reset that password is every 30 days. So if the user's been gone away on a leave of absence or something for 30 days or more, then when they try to log on again, they will not be able to, because users cannot log on until the computers have first logged on using their computer name and the agreed upon password. If the computer missed the synchronization with the password synchronization with the domain controller, then these computers no longer have a trust relationship. And this is not the same as a domain trust relationship. This is a client-server trust relationship between a workstation or member server and the domain controller, where with that agreed upon password, they're able to establish a secure relationship. Now, there are two ways of resolving this issue. Number one, you can do the long way, and that would be, and that's, by the way, also the by-the-book way, according to Microsoft thinking. You right-click on the computer account and choose Reset Account. Now, what we will do with this when we reset the account is we simply make this computer account available again, and just OK to the obvious prompts there. Make that account available again so that whichever computer's client 01 can rejoin the domain. Well, how do you rejoin a domain? We're going to have to reconnect that desktop. Now, we need to log on with administrator credentials, and I'm going to log on with the local administrator account. That's on that local machine, not the domain, because this, of course, will not work since I can't log on to the domain. Because users cannot log on to the domain unless the computer has first logged on to the domain, and we know that that's the problem we're experiencing here. So we log on locally, and at this point, we'll go ahead and join it to a workgroup membership. To do that, we'll right-click on My Computer and choose Properties. And what we're doing is we're actually taking it away from the domain at this point by clicking on the Change button, and this will be the same in any current operating system. Right now you see it's a member of the NuggetLab.com domain, or trying to be anyway, but it's really, in a sense, disjoined from the domain since we've lost that password synchronization, so we'll just join it to a work group. Now, the Microsoft official answer is to just type in any work group. They recommend any work group that you don't actually have in operation here. I'm kind of lazy, so I just usually type in W. No sense in typing in the whole thing because this will be just temporary. What I do is I'll join it to a work group, and then I'll OK everything, and then I'll join it back to the domain, at which point it can use the existing computer account that's already in Active Directory. So then we'll click OK here, and again, it doesn't matter what the name of the work group is, and then we'll be asked for credentials for someone that's got the permissions to remove the computer from the domain. So we'll enter in some credentials there and click OK. Next, we get a message that we're welcomed to the work group, and it says we have to restart the computer. We click OK here, and then Microsoft's instructions would be to click OK here as well, and then click yes to restart the computer. Then once you restart the computer, it comes back up. You'll go to the same dialog box and join it to the domain. Let me give you a quick shortcut with this to save yourself, 3-4 minutes or whatever it takes to restart a computer. You don't have to restart it this way. You see, what happens now is if I restart now, join it to the domain, I'll have to restart again. Instead, just click No here, and this works just as well, and this is just the James Conrad method of shortcuts here. Go back to your system properties without restarting, go back to the computer name, change again, and then join it to the domain here. And we'll just join it to nuggetlab.com, and OK. As long as we're rejoining it to the domain, we'll enter in the domain credentials of an administrator that has the rights to be able to do that, and we'll click OK. It'll welcome us to that domain. There's our message there. We click OK, OK. And then we'll move this up, click OK. And this time when it asks us to restart, we would actually have to say yes. And that way we have only one restart instead of two. So we'll go ahead and restart that one, and then I'll close this up, and we'll get back over here. Now, how does that really differ from just deleting this computer account and then going to that workstation or member server and then just joining it to the domain from there, because it'll automatically create a computer account by this same name anyway? Well, remember that a new computer account that's created there, even though it'll have the same name, will have a different SID. Therefore, any of the properties of this computer account will be different. For example, if this client 01 was the member of several groups, security groups, I would have to then go through the additional chore of joining it to those different groups as well. If I had some kind of custom description or location description in there and all that kind of stuff, I'd have to enter in those kinds of things in as well. So really, it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other, just whichever you find easier. You can just delete it from here if you don't have anything particularly special about this account. Just delete it from here, and then go back to your workstation or member server, join it to a work group like I did before, then rejoin it to a domain. It'll automatically recreate another account by the same name. On the other hand, if you have specific characteristics of this account that you want to keep, then just reset the account and then disjoin and rejoin that workstation or member server to the domain. Now, another advantage for resetting an account is if that computer account was in a specific organizational unit, then it would still remain in that same organizational unit as well. Whereas if we just do the method where we delete this and then rejoin the computer or workstation or member server to the domain, then it's just going to plop it in whatever the default container is, such as computers here, which might not be the desired behavior. Now, as an additional precaution, if we know that this user is going to go away on maternity leave, then when she leaves the office, we'll just right-click on her computer account and choose Disable the account and say yes. And we would probably do the same with her user account if we know that her computer is not going to be connecting to the domain and she's not going to be logging on during the entire period of time that she's gone. And that just helps us plug a potential security hole for both the user and the computer account. Now, for the computer account, it's extremely difficult and unlikely that someone would surreptitiously be able to assume the identity of that computer and log on anyway, but we always try to plug potential security holes wherever possible. Now, let me also point out that I've given you a scenario in which the user goes away with their laptop for several days and then they miss the password reset duration. What's supposed to happen, actually, when she comes back is that the client should still be able to resynchronize with the server. It should just agree upon the password after it's missed that synchronization. However, I just found in practical experience that a lot of times the client or the member server and the domain controller just seem to get out of sync and they can't seem to resynchronize with each other. So that's when you have to manually reset the computer account like you've seen me do here. Now, let me also point out that you can run some tests for this. So if you want to go to a command prompt from any workstation or member server, you can run a utility called nltest. And it's a support tools command, which you'll see on the Windows Server 2003 CD-ROM under the support tools directory. You have to install all the tools, and then you'll be able to run NLTest. When you do that, if there has been a problem with the client or member server and the domain controller, it'll give you a message something like this: error access denied. And this means that we have lost that secure connection between the member server and the workstation. In this case, once again, the client and the workstation and the domain controller have lost the password synchronization. So what I'm going to do is disjoin and rejoin this workstation to the domain, at which point I'll come back and show you what this command should look like if there is a successful connection between the two. Alright, now then, let's cut ahead here where I have joined the computer to a work group, then joined it to the domain again so that we can reset everything properly after having reset the computer account. Then when we run NLTest here with SC query against the domain, when we press enter, we see that we did have success. It's located the domain controller as a timed server. Here's the name of the domain controller found. So everything seems to be okay with this. And let me show you also one other command you can run. It's still NLTest, but it's with different parameter. And that's this right here, an NLTest with SC change password, nuggetlab.com. Now, why would I want to do that? Well, if I know that this workstation is going to be gone for maintenance or some other purpose, or a member server is going to be gone for a while, then I can just go ahead and change the password right now. That gives me 30 days in advance. Whereas otherwise, maybe that password would have otherwise changed tomorrow, and then I might run into a password synchronization problem. So I'm just going to go ahead and change it right away to guarantee that I give myself 30 days. And that's all you have to do is run that command line sequence that I gave you there, and you're good to go for the next 30 days. Now also, if you do like the command line or you're more comfortable with it and you want to reset computer accounts, or if you want to do this again in a batch and you can use again your spreadsheet or something like this to create a batch file, you can use netdom to reset computer accounts. You just name the computer account like you've seen me do here, and then it will reset the computer account that way if you want. Again, very handy if you have a batch of machines especially that you want to reset. Another thing you can use is to use the dsmod command, and you would just use dsmod computer followed by the distinguished name of the computer. And again, you can use a spreadsheet and batch file if you want with this as well. And then a -reset to reset those accounts, and that works equally as well. In this nugget, we took a look at computer accounts. Now, computer accounts have a username and a password, so they also log on to the domain. You need to have an account, first of all, so we look at creating an account as a separate step, and then in a second step, joining a computer to the domain. There are actually two separate steps that occur. Well, you can also join a computer to the domain and automatically create the computer account, but when you do that, it just dumps the computer account into the computer's container. We looked at the redir cmp command, or the redir computer command, in a previous nugget, but here we look at it in more detail, how you can avoid dumping computers into the computer's container. We can also look at batch automation, which will allow you to not only specify where you want those computer accounts to go, but also allows you to create multiple accounts at one time. Then you can move accounts. Various types of group memberships will allow you to move them to different locations. So we'll take a look at some of the impact of that, as well as how to troubleshoot computer accounts when they cannot successfully log on. Because if the computer account can't log on, then the user accounts can't log on either. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.